And welcome back to centralcoastradio.com. Well, there is a very, very fascinating documentary that is about to be released in Australia. It's called Pacific Mother, and it's from director Katherine McRae. And we thought we'd actually get Katherine on the phone today to chat a little bit about this amazing documentary. So welcome to the program, Katherine.
Thank you.
Katherine, tell us a little bit about Pacific Mother. I've had the opportunity to sit down and watch the film, but of course our listeners haven't. So tell us a little bit about the topic explored in Pacific Mother.
Well, broadly, it's about maternity care in the Pacific region. The project grew out of a short documentary I made in 2019 called Water Baby, and that came about because my Japanese producer friend, Migiwa Ozawa, knew a woman called Sachiko Fukumoto who lives in Japan, but her partner is a New Zealander called William Trowbridge, and he is a world champion freediver, and she's a freediver as well, and an actress, and also a woman who specialises in performing underwater. So she has appeared in many films doing that as well. And Sachiko got pregnant, and she loves water. She at first wanted to give birth in the ocean, but that really proved difficult. So their fallback position was a home water birth. And she thought that would be quite straightforward, but it was almost impossible in Okinawa, where she lives. And eventually some midwives over there said, well, if you're really keen to have that much choice and control over your birth, then why don't you go to New Zealand, where your partner's homeland, because they have a really good midwifery system there, and you'll probably get what you want. So that's what happened. And she rang our mutual friend Migiwa and said, why don't we make a short film about this? Because she was starting to realise that she wasn't the only woman who was struggling to have choice over how she gave birth. So we did that, and I got funding here, and we made this 9-minute film, and we sent it out into the world. We translated it to lots of languages, and it got about 7 or 8 million views. And we thought, well, hell, there's a real audience out there for material about women's experience, and particularly parenting. I mean, we've got a lot of films in the world about murder and war and things, but not that many about birthing.
Exactly, yeah. And what was it about when you first heard that story? What was it about Sachiko's story that made you want to tell it on film?
Well, if you see either Water Baby or Pacific Mother, if the viewers see any images, they'll see that they're incredibly visually rich stories. Even with Water Baby, we had this amazing archive that Sachiko and William gave us of them swimming underwater, and underwater cinematographers love working with them because, one of William's aims in life is to work out how to swim really efficiently underwater. So he almost looks like a dolphin, it's extraordinary. One of the things he did while Sachiko was pregnant was swim the Cook Strait between the North and South Island in New Zealand. But more like a dolphin, he was sort of going, in and under the water, rather than your normal freestyle. He did this to raise money for our endangered native dolphins, called them Maui dolphins and Hector dolphins. So it's quite extraordinary what they get up to. So, and of course, I am struck by the fact that a lot of us are really comfortable in the water, and is that related to the fact that when we were before birth, we were in a watery environment in the amniotic fluid. And so seeing photos of pregnant Sachiko suspended in water, I immediately start thinking about babies in utero. So I'm playing with that metaphor, a visual metaphor, through both films, really.
One of the things I loved about this documentary is that you talk about, like, as you said, Sachiko had a way that she wanted to give birth but found that she couldn't. And it's interesting because just a couple of days after I watched this film, I was talking to my uncle he's very, very proud of our Scandinavian heritage. And he actually found out that when he passes away in Australia, it's illegal from the government to do a traditional Scandinavian funeral in Australia. When you were making this documentary, how many different things did you find that is traditional for women to give birth, but they're not allowed to do in certain countries? Like, is that something that you found over and over when you were putting together this documentary?
Absolutely. In New Zealand, Māori, there was a tohunga suppression act, so they were the traditional Māori doctors and midwives, and so the traditional way of looking after Māori was outlawed in New Zealand, and so it's been a process for them to get their culture back, and what we find in the film, of course, is that in Japan, surprisingly, we found out that there was an amazing midwifery system in Japan up until the end of World War II. And of course, they lost that war, and the American GHQ took over, and their rules came in, and America doesn't have a history of midwifery. Their care is doctors and nurses and obstetric nurses. And so they brought that system of care into Japan and made it incredibly difficult for these midwives to survive. So they used to have a system where there were women in the community who ran midwifery houses, maternity houses, and women would go there to give birth. So that's all been destroyed. So and now they're looking, and weirdly, now they're looking to New Zealand to inspire them to bring it back.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how these things are getting passed around. But our feeling with the film was, if we're looking forward to think what's the best way to what's the best system for women and birthing, parents and birthing, and that could be invented. And I think we wanted to look back and to see what those traditions were, because back then birth was mostly female-centred. And I mean, having said that, we do have a good system in New Zealand, which is called continuity of care, which the World Health Organization says is the sort of gold standard for maternity care. So that's midwives looking after women before birth, during birth, and after birth. And all of those stages are so crucial, as I'm sure you can imagine, and especially as the statistics are showing us is that even though medicalisation has taken the mortality around birth right down, which is of course fantastic, weirdly we're getting an increase in maternal suicide, and so that points to bad postnatal care and also birth trauma that women haven't had a chance to work through and talk about. We don't all get the birth we want, but it's really, really helpful if there's someone, i.e. possibly a midwife, who you can talk to about that after birth and say, what happened? What happened? And maybe they can explain it. Maybe they can help you, or maybe they can help you complain, or whatever is needed.
Yeah. How did Australia shape up when you were doing your research for this documentary? How did you find that Australia has shaped up? Because I've heard some horror stories from family friends over the past few years about birthing in Australia, and even with my mother back in the 70s when she gave birth to me, she went into labour 2 months early, and the hospital refused to believe that she was actually in labour, and she almost gave birth to me at home, which they said probably would have resulted in me dying, because I had to get rushed straight into a humidity crib because I was so prem. But how did Australia shape up when you were doing your research for this documentary?
Well, we found out while we were making the film that 4 Australian women were making the film Birth Time, which has now come out, and so that really covers it. That really confirmed that it wasn't up to us to tell your story, and of course we had a really limited budget, so we stuck to 5 other countries. Yeah. I got the impression from Birth Time that there's a real fight going on in Australia at the moment for women to have more choice around birthing. I know that in our film we touch on the fact that in New Zealand women and midwives and parents generally fought for improved midwifery care in the 1980s in New Zealand. There was a woman who she lobbied her MP, which so happened to be Helen Clark, way before she became Prime Minister. And she really talked to her about how, okay, you could have a home birth, but the midwife was paid like $90 and the doctor had to be there, had to be called at the last minute to sign off, and he'd be given $200 or whatever, way back then. And so she explained all these problems to Helen Clark, and about 8 years later, Helen Clark became Minister of Health for about a year, and she decided she'd change two things, which was introduce smoke-free legislation and change the legislation around birthing. And all she really needed to do was say a doctor or a qualified midwife could be at the birth. And then after that, we made even more changes. But that was the crucial change, and that happened in 1990. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm hoping our film is, in its own quiet way, a contribution to that, to all parents in all the different countries that see it, to improve their birthing, but it might take a bit of agitation.
Definitely. Katherine, one of the questions I love to ask documentary filmmakers is, what did you learn when you were making this documentary? Was there something that really stood out for you that you learnt while you were making Pacific Mother?
Oh, so many things. The thing that I learnt from Water Baby that got me really interested was when Sachiko said the more time she spent with nature, the more in touch with her instincts she was. Yep. And so that's really one major reason why I've concentrated on these women who are very connected to the ocean. Because, of course, if they're freediving, they have to be very aware of their breath and their body, because it's a very dangerous thing to do.
Yep.
And therefore it's no surprise that when it came to birthing, these women wanted to have as natural a birth as they could. And yeah, I feel that resonated with me because, I was sort of a teenager in the late 70s, and there was a lot of women getting in touch with their bodies back then, learning about orgasms and things like that. When it hadn't really been talked about before that, and I suppose I had expected that to keep going.
Yeah.
But there was a pushback, and there's been in the 90s and the early 2000s. A lot of women have got out of touch with our bodies, and seen them as sexual objects, rather than amazing. Like it's incredible when you get pregnant and your breasts start changing, and you go, man, they're amazing. Aren't they amazing? They produce milk.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful thing, and it's just never it's not celebrated enough.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, Katherine, we're hoping that a lot of our listeners will head along to see Pacific Mother. So to finish off our interview, what would you like to say to people out there who are about to sit down and watch your amazing film?
Well, I do want to, of course, always note that we're not anti-medicalisation. I had very medicalised births, and especially for my twins, I really, really had to. I wouldn't have them today if I hadn't had that. So it's not about that. It's about women's empowerment and parents knowing what's going on as much as possible and being supported to have the birth they want, and with the culture that they want, as you say, like for your father to have the funeral rites that he wants. Why is that difficult? Why is that not possible for him? All of those different traditions should be able to be encompassed in our birthing and our funeral rites.
Definitely. Well, Katherine, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to us today. It's been an absolute privilege having you on the show, and thank you so much.